Alright, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start our first spring break screencast with the topic of internment and enemy aliens. So this is a topic that's pretty near and dear to my heart. I actually wrote my master's thesis about Italian enemy aliens, and so I have a lot of information, so I'm going to kind of condense it down for you guys and try and hit the big points here. But as far as this whole topic, there's a lot of vocabulary that you want to be able to understand as far as the difference between internment, what's an enemy alien, and kind of why the Japanese are in some ways treated differently than the Italians and the Germans. So the first big thing that we have to take a look at as a group is who falls into this category of what's considered an enemy alien. And so an enemy alien is anybody who's coming from one of the Axis power countries. So they could be a German immigrant, they could be an Italian immigrant, they could be a Japanese immigrant. And these are people who are foreign nationals. They've never become American citizens. And so for all of these groups, these people are going to be under some scrutiny. Simply because they're a foreigner, even if they've been living here for 30, 40 years, they're still coming from a foreign country that we're now at war with. And so they're going to be dealing with extra scrutiny. So this is not different for the Germans, the Italians, or the Japanese. They're all going to be kind of dealing with some level of investigation into their lives and some level of scrutiny. But where things start to get different is how American citizens are treated. So as far as Italian and German American citizens, they pretty much retain all of their rights, except for a few exceptions who are outspoken, opponents of Mussolini or outspoken opponents of the Nazis. They're going to kind of retain their full rights. The Japanese is kind of where you see it different, where the Japanese are not treated as Americans first, but more as Japanese first and Americans second. So you have a very unique situation in the United States. You have people coming from all over the world. At this time, we have about 15, 20 million Germans in the country. You have about roughly 5 million Italians and much smaller figures for Japanese. I believe the numbers are somewhere in the range of about 150,000 to 250,000 Japanese living in the country. So you have this big population that has roots somewhere else. And so it becomes a question of how do we deal with these people? Do we treat them differently? Do we treat them as Americans? Do we treat them as foreigners? And so the government's going to try and grapple with this whole question. And so what you start to see here is kind of a mistrust starts to grow amongst the government and in some cases the people and some of these foreign groups. So this is a very famous propaganda poster. Says don't speak the enemy's language. It's kind of referring to Italian, Japanese, or German during this era. Now this is not the first time that you've seen this xenophobia kind of sweep across the United States in a wartime period. We saw it earlier in World War I with the German immigrants and kind of the backlash that the Germans saw as a result of us fighting against Germany. Now, during World War II, what's going to kind of amplify this is that they're going to start to pass more restrictive rules and regulations for a lot of these foreign groups. So the first act that they're going to pass that really tries to address this whole issue is going to be Executive Order 9066. And so this order kind of does a few different things. First off, it kind of sets up rules for what's considered enemy aliens, so foreigners living within the United States. And what any enemy alien has to do, even if you weren't an enemy alien, but you were living with somebody who was in your household, so let's say you're American-born, but your parents were born in Germany. What these people had to do is kind of abide by special regulations. So one thing that they had to do was hand in any type of firearm that they had. They had to hand in any radios that they had they could possibly use to communicate with an enemy. They also had special curfews depending on where you live. A lot of this was relegated to the west coast of the United States because America was more concerned with being attacked on the west coast than on the east coast, basically because of the Pacific and what was going on with Japan out on the west coast. And so they also, in certain cases, had to move from designated areas. So if you look at this map here, this right here, this pinkish area, is what they would designate like a military zone. So if you were an enemy alien and you lived in this zone, this part of California, this part of Oregon or Washington, you had to move inland. So a lot more people than you would expect were really affected by this because you do have pretty big populations of Italians out here and especially Japanese, and so they're going to be asked in some cases to move inland into what the government kind of deems safer areas for them. Because what the government is concerned about is spying, infiltrating American society, handing over information to the enemy. Now, when you look at this situation, so this is kind of a notice showing you what they actually had to hand in. And they printed it on all these foreign languages and all these different newspapers so that they could try and get the message out to the different people from the different backgrounds in the United States. Now, the person who's behind this, a lot of it, I mean, FDR signs off on it, but the person who's behind it is the Attorney General at the time, which is a guy named Francis Biddle, and he kind of is the one who kind of goes about delineating who's going to go into internment camps, and kind of runs the head of the investigation. And so one of the products of this whole situation is they're going to also create, basically it's a House investigative committee called the House Un-American Activities Committee. And what they did was they would kind of inspect not only foreigners, it starts with foreigners during World War II, but then they're going to also inspect American citizens who they deem doing un-American activities. Basically what they're looking for are people who are not loyal to the United States, and what they're going to try and do is detain these people. So what you see happen here, you have the three nationalities. You have the Japanese, you have the Germans, and you have the Italians. Now they dealt with the three nationalities differently. The Italians and the Germans, what they did, even with the enemy aliens, as far as whether they're going to put them in internment camps or not, they did individual interviews. They went to their neighbors. They tried to find out about them, find out, were they big proponents of Mussolini? Did they own a newspaper? Did they own a radio station that was, espousing fascist ideology? They tried to individually investigate these people. When you look at the Japanese, they don't do individual investigations. So that's the first big difference. The second big difference with the Japanese and the European Americans is that what they're going to do here with the Japanese is enemy aliens and American-born Japanese are both treated the same. So they're both taken to internment camps, and you can see some of the more famous ones here, like Heart Mountain and Topaz, and they had them in various places. In Montana they had a bunch of them. Some of them are in California. A lot of them are in the West, in like the desert area, because it's kind of considered the safest part for the United States. And that's also where we did a lot of our military testing during World War II and after World War II. But they're going to take them to these internment camps. Now, there has to be a big question as to why. Why did they treat the Japanese differently than the Italians and the Germans? With those enemy aliens, they did individual investigations, and then with the Japanese, whether they were an enemy alien or they were an American citizen who happened to be of the Japanese descent, they all got taken to internment camps who lived in continental United States. Why did they do that? There can be a lot of different reasons. And so I'm going to ask you guys to kind of weigh in on that. It's going to be our question for this screencast, why you think they did it, why you think they treated them differently. One theory is, as far as Pearl Harbor, the Japanese directly attacked us on American soil. The other theory has a lot of racist elements to it. You could also look at it in the sense that, well, their population's a lot smaller than the Italian and the German population. Maybe it was easier to kind of, remove them. But in some ways, you can kind of say, well, maybe the Japanese were looked at as the other. They weren't as assimilated into American society. They weren't white. They didn't fit in with the other groups, like the Italians and the Germans did. So all those things, I think, kind of play into why the Japanese are treated differently than the Italians and the Germans during this situation. Now, one thing that I think is very interesting, the state that has the biggest Japanese population at the time is Hawaii. And the Japanese in Hawaii were not interned. So I think that's a very interesting aspect of it. Why were only the people on the continental United States Japanese people in the continental United States interned and not those out in the islands. And a lot of it's also relegated to the West Coast. They are more concerned about the West Coast than they are, about the East Coast. Now, what was a typical internment camp like? I was reading some of your daily quizzes today, and it kind of bothers me when you guys call these things concentration camps. I mean, this is definitely not the best situation in the world, but these are not concentration camps. And some of you guys even said, well, they treated them the same as the Jews were treated in Germany. That couldn't be further from the truth. They do not. This is not a place where people are going to die, and where they're, being tortured. What they're doing is removing them from the general population, and they're putting them in these camps. They're military-style camps. They're not four-star hotels, but they're not. They're also not being, degraded and being treated horribly. They're being given 3 square meals a day. They're getting schools. They're getting things that ordinary Americans would get during the time period. They're just being separated. So they are being segregated and taken away. And so the other big question that this brings up is this a violation of their rights? They are American citizens, a lot of them, and are their rights being violated by taking them out of their homes and forcing them to move into these internment camps? I think that's the bigger question, did this violate people's rights? Did this violate the 14th Amendment? This was challenged in the Supreme Court. A very famous Supreme Court case is called Korematsu versus the United States. And it gets to the Supreme Court in 1944. And this case is Korematsu, he's Japanese. He tried to pretend like he was Chinese so that he wouldn't get taken to the internment camp, but eventually he gets caught. And so he's taken into internment, but he sues. And basically he's saying this is a violation of my rights. Now, he ends up losing the case, Korematsu, and the reason that he ends up losing his case is because the Supreme Court basically uses the argument that it's kind of a situation of, similar to what they said in World War I about danger, and that it's better for the country as a whole, and that's kind of what the law is intending. It's kind of the wartime situation where powers are changed and powers are different, and they can be expanded during wartime. So they kind of say if this had happened during a peacetime period, then yes, Korematsu had a case, but since it happened during a war, things are different. Powers are changed, and the power of the government can be expanded during a war, and so therefore it was not a violation of his rights. Now, later on in history, the American government is going to kind of take a different stance on this, and they actually provide compensation, I think in the late 1980s, to Japanese Americans, descendants of Japanese Americans who were put into internment, kind of almost like an acceptance of guilt or acceptance of apology for what they did. Now, for the white minority groups in the United States, World War II, so this includes the Italians and includes the Germans, World War II is a chance to kind of prove that they are American. So when I say this phrase, graduating to whiteness, in early American history, being an American and being white are kind of like a synonymous thing. And so these other groups, these other ethnic groups, the Italians, the Jews, these other groups were not considered full Americans. They lived here, but to your homegrown Americans, they were not quote-unquote white, and they were not considered to be full Americans. And so World War II is their opportunity to prove their loyalty to the country and prove their worth to the country, and they want to kind of prove that. And so if you remember in class, we talked about these restrictive quota laws that were passed during the 1920s, and they're still in place in the 1940s. And so it's restricting Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans primarily. And they're passing all these laws, like these literacy tests, to stop them from voting and stop them from participating in American democracy. And what you see happen during World War II, this is a British poster, but the same thing happens in America. It's the first time you start to see people promoting this idea of multiculturalism, that we have to put our differences aside to come together as a country and to come together as a community. All right, I'm running out of time, guys, so we're going to cut the screencast here. There are more to come, pretty soon.